So I'm Sally Goddard Blythe, and I first started to work at INPP in 1988. Initially on a part-time basis, because I still had 3 very small children under 6 and couldn't work full-time. And at that time, Peter Blythe, who started INPP, and his colleague David McGlowan had done a tremendous amount of work in developing the protocols for assessment, in devising the specific exercises as reflex inhibition and stimulation and integration exercises, and in writing up the clinical part of the work that they had developed. But there was very little at the time written about, well, written specifically for parents and for other professionals generally about how primitive and postural reflexes affect development, affect education, and that something can be done about them. So my first task really was to try and perhaps democratize some of the work that they had developed. And so it was in answer to that I wrote A Teacher's Window into the Child's Mind in 1996. And from there followed various others. The Well-Balanced Child, which was written more for parents. The academic textbook, Attention, Balance and Coordination, which was really an attempt to try and take this work into academia with a view to it becoming available to other professionals as a tool in their toolbox which they can use with specific training. And then subsequently a book called What Babies and Children Really Need, and my latest one, The Genius of Natural Childhood, which are probably my passion because I feel very strongly that modern technological society and societies driven by economics are risking eroding the natural childhood that is so important for children's biological development. In continental Europe, I'm helped tremendously by a number of people who've trained with INPP in the past, have worked very successfully with it, and then applied to INPP in Chester to be allowed to provide the training in their own country in their own language. So we have set up a number of principles of INPP in different countries where they are doing just this. They are delivering the INPP training in the local language as if they were INPP Chester delivering it here. So that has spread the word quite extensively, particularly in Germany, where several thousand professionals have been trained over the last 16 years or so. It's also in the Netherlands, in Italy, in Finland, in Poland. It's starting in the USA in 2000 and later this year, 2011, and in New Zealand and South Africa and other countries around the world, including Mexico, which has just come to mind. Well, that was an invitation by a group called the International Alliance for Childhood, who do some wonderful work throughout the world, but one of their particular areas at the moment is looking at child well-being throughout the world. So I was invited to go and give a presentation to a working group at the European Parliament at the invitation of the International Alliance for Childhood. And so what we were talking about was the importance of movement opportunity, free space for children to play and to develop physical skills, and social engagement in the life of the young child, and how this could be provided as something that is every child's right. And the aim was to perhaps put a motion to the European Parliament at some time in the future that it is the fundamental right of the child to have the space and the opportunity to develop the physical skills that are necessary to support all aspects of learning and of living for the remainder of life. A screening test for physicians. Because at the moment the INPP work lives in something of a professional vacuum. My academic background is as a psychologist, as was Peter Blythe's. He was a PhD psychologist. The assessment techniques that we use are perhaps closer to traditional occupational therapy assessments or physiotherapy assessments, but the application of the method is to problems of an educational and a behavioural nature. So that has meant that we have spanned the professional domains of medicine, education and psychology, but we don't quite belong to any one of them. And this mirrors actually the population of children who we see. These are children who also fall through the net of services which should be in place to identify their problems and to provide effective intervention. Because the majority of children we see are children who are not quite bad enough to have been diagnosed with a medical problem, but neither do they have all the skills and the equipment in place to be able to realize their potential and achieve as they should be able to achieve educationally in the classroom. And so because they're not bad enough, they inhabit what we describe as a grey area where they don't belong quite in anyone's professional domain. So both as a profession helping these children and the children themselves, there is a gap in the system. And what I would like to see for the future is that the method is recognised as a method in its own right that can be applied by any suitable professional who has received the appropriate training in the method. So that could be doctors to recognise a need, to make a referral, psychologists and educational psychologists to do much the same, that physiotherapists, occupational therapists and speech therapists could do the assessments and the intervention, but equally teachers or special needs teachers could also be trained to do this within the educational setting, so that this becomes part of a number of different professionals' practice. At the moment, there are individual schools who have trained how to use the school programme. Once they've started to use it, they have found it so effective, not just for the specific problems they thought it was going to tackle, but actually more generally in terms of children's development, their poise, their posture, behaviour in the playground. Just general development seems to be enhanced by this. So at the moment it's in individual pockets, and if this is ever to be adopted as such, it probably now needs to go up to the next level and be something that is looked at from a governmental or a policy level as something that is recognised as an important part of the curriculum. Now within that, before we even look at the intervention, my particularly strong feeling is that the developmental testing of all children, physical developmental testing of all children, should be reinstated into a part of our education system. And this is not something new, this is actually reinventing the wheel. When my eldest son, who was born in 1981, first went to school, it was standard practice that at Rising 5, every child was seen by a school doctor who would assess certain motor skills, such as the ability to stand on one leg, to hop to one end of the room and back again, pile some bricks, and very basic vision tests and hearing tests were done. Then we entered an era of so-called evidence-based medicine, whereby if a problem had been found, it was also necessary to have an effective solution at hand if the routine testing was to continue to be of value. And because at that time, although there were programs that did work, there wasn't a general consensus of what was the right thing to do or where you referred these children to. And this routine developmental testing of all children was phased out. So by my second son was born in 1983, so 5 years after that, that had been phased out. Now we know that there are things that can be done within schools which do make a difference. Then to me this developmental testing should be reinstated, and not just at the time of school entry, but perhaps again 2 or 3 years later and in the year prior to moving to secondary school, so that there are various stages, key stages in children's education where they are going to be picked up if there is a problem. If the problem is severe, they're going to be referred to the appropriate agency for something to be done. And if the problem is in the less severe range, then programs within schools can be implemented so that these unnecessary difficulties don't continue to haunt a child, not only through its school and education career, but quite often through the remainder of its life. At the moment, there is no formal external accreditation, and this is something we have looked at on a number of occasions. And one of the difficulties that we come up with every time is that there is no department or faculty that actually has the skills and the knowledge in place to be able to supervise any postgraduate work. And therefore we need an academic department that is willing, I think, to set this up in conjunction with INPP, to be able to get those standards and to get the curriculum in place, and then to be able to pass it on so that it can go beyond INPP into education generally. Well, there has been a shift probably every 10 years in the 30 to 40 years that this work has been going, as there has in many other diagnostic categories. What often happens is you start off with a label which seems to describe a syndrome pretty well. And then given a few years and that label starts to be used too widely and no longer becomes meaningful for the thing that it was originally designed to describe. So way back in the late 1960s and early 1970s, when Peter Blythe and David McGlowan first started to develop the method, it tended to come under the label of minimal brain dysfunction. But there were something like 99 different symptoms for minimal brain dysfunction, which meant that at one time or another, probably any one of us could have actually fitted into this diagnostic category. And many parents, when they were told that their child had minimal brain dysfunction, didn't hear dysfunction, they heard damage. And there is a big difference. You can have minimal brain dysfunction without there being damage and with there being damage. And so David and Peter moved over to a term called organic brain dysfunction, which they felt described an organic dysfunction that had its origins in brain functioning but wasn't necessarily brain damage. But once again, within 10 years, this term was no longer doing what it was supposed to do. So in the late 80s, early 90s, they tended to move over to neurodevelopmental delay. But neurodevelopmental delay is also quite a general term. It can describe more than just neuromotor immaturity. There can be auditory processing problems within neurodevelopmental delay. There can be visual processing problems. There can be behavioral problems. And there can be global neurodevelopmental delay, which describes profound difficulties, or profound dysfunction. So there was a term that has been used and has come full circle again, neuromotor immaturity, which describes the retention of primitive reflexes beyond the time when they should have been inhibited by higher centers in the brain, and absence or underdevelopment of postural reflexes, with those reflexes acting as markers or signposts of maturity in the functioning of the central nervous system. So when we're looking at a cluster of abnormal primitive and postural reflexes, we are looking at markers of neuromotor immaturity. And to me, that is a more precise term to define the whole area that we are covering in our work with abnormal reflexes and problems with balance, coordination, and the related oculomotor functions.